In the heart of a quiet suburban neighborhood, Tasha had just finished her shift at the local diner. It had been a long day, but she felt a sense of relief knowing she would soon be home with her son, Isaiah. The evening sky painted soft hues of orange and purple, and the streets were calm. As Tasha walked toward her car, she could feel the weight of the long day lifting, knowing she was just moments away from the comfort of home. Tasha was used to the usual bustle of the evening, but something about tonight felt different. The usual noise of the neighborhood seemed quieter than usual, and a strange tension hung in the air. She shrugged it off, telling herself she was just tired, eager to get home. As she approached her car, she noticed a police cruiser slowly driving down the street, its headlights cutting through the dusk. Officer Davis was behind the wheel. Tasha had seen him around before, always with that stern expression, the kind that never seemed to change. There was something unsettling about him, something she couldn't put her finger on. Tasha had heard whispers from other people in the neighborhood about his attitude, stories about how he acted with arrogance and a sense of superiority. But, like most people, she never thought it would be an issue for her. Until now. The cruiser stopped just ahead of her, and Officer Davis rolled down his window. His gaze was cold and distant. Tasha gave him a polite nod, ready to get in her car and drive off, but the officer had other plans. "You're in a hurry, aren't you?" Officer Davis called out sharply. Tasha paused, a frown forming on her face as she looked toward him. "I'm just heading home, officer," she said, keeping her tone calm and respect. Isaiah and his mother, Tasha, moved quickly down the alley, her hand clutching his arm for support as they made their way to the street. The air felt cooler now, the sounds of the world around them slowly come in. The following days after the terrifying incident were filled with a mixture of uncertainty, fear, and an overwhelming sense of determination. Tasha and Isaiah spent much of their time in their small apartment, surrounded by paperwork and calls to lawyers, each conversation feeling like another hurdle they had to overcome. But in the midst of the chaos, there was also an unspoken bond growing stronger between them. They were no longer just mother and son, they were partners in this fight for justice. Every time they sat down to talk, there was a shared understanding that they couldn't back down, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be. Tasha felt exhausted, both physically and emotionally. The memories of what had happened still haunted her. She would often wake up in the middle of the night, her heart racing, her mind replaying the moment when Officer Davis had grabbed her, thrown her to the ground, and bound her with the rope. But whenever she looked over at Isaiah, sitting beside her, she knew she couldn't allow herself to be consumed by fear. She had to keep moving forward for him, for herself, and for everyone who had ever been silenced by injustice. Isaiah, too, had his own battles. The images of that night kept replaying in his mind. He had never imagined that he would be forced into a situation where he had to protect his mother, to fight against an officer of the law. Yet, here he was, standing alongside her, fighting for what was right. It wasn't easy. He was angry. He was scared. But he wasn't going to let fear control him. He wasn't going to let Officer Davis win. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft glow through the apartment windows, Tasha and Isaiah sat at the kitchen table, their phones spread out before them. They had just finished speaking with their lawyer, who had been gathering information about Officer Davis and his past record. So far, everything pointed to a history of misconduct and abuse of power, something that would work in their favor. But it wasn't enough just to have the facts. They needed something more. They needed the truth to be heard. Tasha took a deep breath, her eyes locked on Isaiah. "Are you ready for this, baby?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with concern. She knew that they were about to take a big step. The lawyer had told them that they were ready to move forward with a formal complaint. But it wasn't going to be easy. The system was not kind to people like them, people who spoke out, people who challenged authority. They both knew the risks. Isaiah looked at her, his expression serious. "I've never been more ready in my life," he said, his voice unwavering. "We've got to do this. Not just for us, but for anyone who's been hurt by people like him." Tasha smiled softly, feeling a surge of pride in her chest. She had raised him to be strong, but she never realized how deeply he understood the importance of standing up for what was right. It wasn't just about what happened to them, it was about making sure it didn't happen to anyone else. They had a chance to change things, to make a difference. And they were going to take it. The following days were filled with interviews, meetings, and a growing sense of urgency. Their lawyer worked tirelessly to put together a case, gathering evidence, speaking with witnesses who had seen Officer Davis in action before, and reaching out to others who had been victims of his abuse. It was a long process, and there were moments when Tasha and Isaiah felt like giving up. But every time the doubt crept in, they reminded themselves of the bigger picture. They couldn't let this go. One evening, as they were preparing to leave for another meeting with the lawyer, the doorbell rang. Tasha's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone, and with everything going on, she wasn't sure if she was ready to see anyone. But when she opened the door, she was surprised to find two of their neighbors standing there: Mrs. Henderson, a kind elderly woman who lived across the hall, and Mr. Ramirez, a middle-aged man who had lived next door for years. "Is everything okay?" Mrs. Henderson asked, her voice soft but full of concern. "We heard what happened, and we just wanted to check in on you." Tasha was taken aback by their visit. She had no idea that her neighbors even knew what had happened. But there was something in their faces, a quiet solidarity that made her feel less alone. "We're okay," Tasha said, smiling faintly. "But, we've been through a lot lately." Mr. Ramirez nodded, his expression serious. "We know. We've been following what's been happening. And we want you to know that you're not alone in this. We've been talking to some of the other neighbors, and we're all willing to help however we can." Tasha blinked, surprised by their offer. "You don't have to know," Mrs. Henderson interrupted gently, "we do. No one should have to go through what you've gone through, and we're not going to stand by and let this happen again. If you need anything, witnesses, support, anything, we're here." Tasha felt a lump form in her throat. She had spent so much time focused on the fight ahead that she hadn't stopped to think about the people around her, the community that was still watching, still paying attention. It wasn't just about her and Isaiah anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been hurt by injustice. "Thank you," Tasha said softly, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say. But thank you." Mrs. Henderson smiled warmly, reaching out to give Tasha's hand a gentle squeeze. "We'll be here. You're not alone in this fight." As they left, Isaiah turned to his mother, his expression a mixture of gratitude and determination. "This changes everything, doesn't it?" he said, his voice quieter now. Tasha nodded, wiping away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. "It does," she whispered. "It really does." The days passed quickly, and before they knew it, it was time for the hearing. The courtroom was a cold, intimidating place, filled with lawyers, reporters, and a few members of the public who had shown up to hear the case. Tasha and Isaiah sat together in the front row, their hearts pounding in their chests. The lawyer had told them it could take months, even years, to get the justice they deserved, but they were ready. They had to be. When the case was called, Officer Davis was seated at the defense table, his face tense and cold. But Tasha didn't look at him. She looked at the people in the room, the ones who were willing to stand with her, to hear her story. As she stood to speak, she felt a surge of courage. She wasn't just telling her story anymore. She was telling the story of everyone who had ever been hurt by people in power. She was speaking for those who didn't have a voice, for those who had been silenced. Tasha's voice didn't tremble as she spoke. She was strong now. Stronger than she had ever been. She knew that this wasn't just about them anymore. It was about something bigger, a fight for fairness, for equality, for justice. By the time the hearing ended, Tasha and Isaiah knew that this was only the beginning. But they had already taken the most important step. They had spoken out. And no matter what happened next, their voices had been heard. Together, they had shown that the truth could never be silenced, no matter how loud the world screamed to keep it quiet. They had made a difference and they would continue to make it, every day. G back into focus. The distant sirens grew louder, but there was still an unsettling silence between them, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. Tasha's heart pounded, but not just from the physical pain. She couldn't stop thinking about how close they had come to losing everything. Her body ached, her arms still stinging from where the rope had cut into her skin, but it was the emotional toll that weighed most heavily on her. She had always been SAS. The officers wrapped up their investigation. Tasha and Isaiah were left in the quiet of the street, the flashing lights still casting their eerie glow over the scene. Tasha could feel the weight of the night pressing down on her, but she knew they couldn't stay here forever. There was so much more to do, so much more to fight for. But right now, she just needed to get away from the chaos, away from the reminder of everything that had just happened. Isaiah kept his arm around her shoulders as they made their way to the car. His steps were slow, his mind clearly still processing everything, but there was an unspoken strength in the way he held her, as if he was determined to make sure she was okay. For all his strength, though, Tasha could see that he was struggling too. He had just seen things no son should ever have to see. And though he was trying to stay strong for her, she knew he was hurting. "Mom, I'm sorry. I should have gotten there faster," Isaiah said quietly, his voice breaking the silence between them. Tasha glanced at him, surprised by the words. He had done everything right. He had been there when she needed him most. He had saved her. "No, baby," she said softly, squeezing his hand. "You did exactly what you needed to do. You kept your head. You saved me." He nodded, but she could tell he didn't fully believe her. He was always so hard on himself, never allowing himself to feel like he did enough. Tasha knew she would have to remind him of his strength every chance she got. He had given her the courage to keep fighting, just by being there, just by doing what needed to be done. "I don't want you to think I'm not proud of you," Tasha added, her voice firm and steady. "You showed incredible bravery tonight, Isaiah. You were my hero." Isaiah's lips twisted into a faint smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I just wish it hadn't come to that, Mom. I wish I didn't have to. I wish I didn't have to see you like that. I'm not sure I'll ever forget it." Tasha's heart ached as she looked at her son. She knew how hard it had been for him to witness what had happened. The look in his eyes said it all. She had raised him to be strong, to stand up for what was right, but she never wanted him to face something like this. "I know, baby," she said, her voice full of understanding. "But this is just one chapter in our story. We'll get through this together." They reached the car, and Tasha carefully slid into the passenger seat, her body still sore from the ropes and the struggle. Isaiah climbed into the driver's seat, his hands gripping the wheel tightly as he started the engine. The night was still and quiet, the tension in the air almost palpable. Tasha sat back in the seat, closing her eyes for a moment as they drove away from the scene. It was hard to believe everything had happened so quickly. One minute, she had been walking home from work, and the next, she was fighting for her life. But even though the nightmare had just begun, Tasha knew one thing for certain: they wouldn't be silent. They wouldn't back down. As they drove in silence, the city lights flickering past the windows, Tasha's mind began to race. She had seen what happened to people who spoke up, people who stood against the system. She knew that this wasn't going to be easy. But she also knew it was necessary. She couldn't let Davis get away with what he had done. Not to her, and not to anyone else. She looked over at Isaiah, who was focused on the road ahead, his expression unreadable. He was still processing everything, but she could see the fire in his eyes, the same fire that had driven him to act when she needed him most. She could see the way he was already planning what they needed to do next, the way he was ready to fight for justice. "Isaiah," Tasha began, her voice low, "we're going to make sure Davis pays for what he did. We can't let him get away with this." Isaiah didn't look at her, but she could hear the resolve in his voice when he spoke. "I know, Mom. I'm not letting him off the hook. He can't just do this and get away with it." Tasha smiled softly, proud of her son. He was ready to stand up for what was right. And she would be right there with him. "We'll start by talking to a lawyer," Tasha said, her voice steady. "We need to make sure we have all our facts straight. We'll get the right people on our side." Isaiah nodded, his grip tightening on the wheel. "I'll do whatever it takes, Mom. I won't let him hurt anyone else." The drive back to their apartment seemed longer than usual, as the weight of the night hung heavily between them. But there was also a sense of purpose growing within them, a quiet determination to make sure that no one else would ever have to face what they had just gone through. Tasha wasn't sure what the future would hold, but she knew they couldn't keep quiet. They had to speak out. For her, for Isaiah, and for everyone who had ever been silenced by fear. When they finally arrived at their apartment, Tasha felt a sense of relief wash over her. She was home. But even as she stepped out of the car, she knew it wasn't over. They had taken the first step tonight, but there was still much to be done. As Tasha reached for her keys, Isaiah followed her up the stairs to their door. She could feel the weight of his presence beside her, the support he had always given her. She had spent so many years taking care of him, but now, it was his turn to take care of her. Once inside, they settled on the couch, both exhausted but determined. Tasha could feel the tiredness in her bones, but she didn't want to sleep just yet. She wanted to make sure Isaiah knew how proud she was of him. "I'm really proud of you," she said softly, her voice filled with warmth. "You were amazing tonight. I couldn't have done this without you." Isaiah looked at her, his face softening for the first time all night. "I'm just glad I was able to help. I couldn't stand seeing you hurt." Tasha placed her hand on his, squeezing it gently. "You didn't just help, baby. You saved me. And together, we're going to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Isaiah nodded, his eyes steady. "We will. I promise." For the first time since the incident, Tasha felt a sense of peace settle over her. There was still much to be done, but she knew they were in this together. She didn't have to face this alone. They were a team. And no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, she knew that together, they would fight for what was right. They would be heard. They would make a difference. Wrong for Isaiah, and now he had to be strong for her. "Mom, we're almost there," Isaiah said, his voice steady, but Tasha could hear the underlying tension in it. He was trying to be brave for her, trying to hide his own fear, but she knew he was terrified, too. He had seen things no child should ever see, and now, there was a look in his eyes one she had never seen before. It was the look of someone who had been forced to grow up too fast, someone who had been forced to witness the cruelty that came from hate. "I'm okay, Isaiah," she whispered, trying to reassure him. She felt exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but she couldn't afford to let him see her crumble. "Not now. I'm okay, thanks to you." Isaiah nodded, but he didn't speak. His mind was racing, replaying everything that had just happened. He couldn't get the image of his mother lying on the ground, struggling for breath, out of his mind. He had never imagined something like that happening to her, not to someone as strong and loving as his mom. She had always been his protector, his guide. Now, he had to protect her. The sound of the sirens was growing louder, and soon, they could hear the screech of tires as the police cars pulled up to the street. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the darkened alley, and a few officers quickly rushed out of their vehicles. Tasha's knees almost buckled from the weight of everything, but Isaiah caught her in time. "You're safe now, Mom," he said softly, helping her sit on the nearby curb. His hand was firm on her shoulder, but it was shaking slightly. He was doing his best to stay calm, but the shock of the night was still heavy on him. The officers approached cautiously, their hands resting on their belts, but their faces softened when they saw Tasha. They must have noticed the way she was shaking, the bruises on her wrists, the evidence of what had happened. "Ma'am, are you all right?" one of the officers asked, his voice gentle, almost apologetic. Tasha looked up at him, her eyes still filled with a mixture of disbelief and fear. She hadn't spoken much since Isaiah had freed her. Everything felt surreal. Her hands trembled as she clutched her son's arm, still trying to process everything that had just happened. I'm okay," she said, though her voice was shaky. I need to tell you what happened." Isaiah looked at his mom, his jaw clenched. "Mom, it's okay. You don't have to explain everything right now." But Tasha shook her head, her eyes meeting the officers with quiet determination. "No, I do," she said. "Because this can't happen to anyone else." The officer nodded, signaling for another to come over and take her statement. Tasha's mind was still spinning, but she knew this was the moment to speak up, to make sure this officer, this man who had crossed the line, was held accountable for what he had done. Isaiah sat beside her, his hand never leaving her side, his heart pounding in his chest. The police officer was asking questions now, but Isaiah wasn't paying attention. His focus was on his mother. He watched her carefully as she spoke to the officers, her voice strong but still shaken. He could see the tears building in her eyes, but she wouldn't let them fall. She wasn't going to break down in front of anyone. Not after everything she had been through. "You're going to be all right, Mom," Isaiah whispered, his voice low, just for her. "They're going to take care of everything." But Tasha wasn't so sure. She had lived long enough to know that sometimes, things didn't work out the way you hoped. Sometimes, the system didn't protect you. Sometimes, the people who were supposed to serve and protect made mistakes, big mistakes. And sometimes, those mistakes were too big to fix. The officer that had been with her all along finished his questions and began to turn away, his face serious. Isaiah could tell the man was getting ready to call it in, to report what had happened, but something inside Isaiah refused to let that moment slip by. "What about Officer Davis?" Isaiah asked suddenly, his voice rising with an edge of anger. "Are you going to let him walk away after what he did? Are you just going to let him get away with it?" The officer turned back to him, his face unreadable. "Son, I understand your anger, but we need to follow procedure. We'll investigate what happened." Isaiah's chest tightened. "Investigate," he repeated, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "You've got to be kidding me. I saw it. My mom saw it. Officer Davis did this. He hurt her. And now, you're telling me you're going to investigate." Tasha placed a hand on her son's arm, a gentle reminder for him to calm down. She knew the anger he was feeling. She felt it too. But they couldn't afford to let it control them, not now. "I know it's hard, Isaiah," she said softly, her voice steady despite the storm inside. "But we have to let them do their job. We can't solve everything ourselves." Isaiah's eyes were hard with frustration, but he nodded. He wasn't happy with it, but he knew his mother was right. They couldn't do this alone. Not yet. As the officers continued to work around them, taking statements and gathering information, Tasha tried to focus on the simple act of breathing. She had never felt so vulnerable before. But in that moment, she realized something important: she wasn't alone. Isaiah had stood by her when it mattered most. He had shown more courage than she could have ever imagined. The sirens faded into the distance as the officers finished their work and prepared to leave. Tasha felt a weight lift from her chest, but there was still much to be done. The battle wasn't over. She had to make sure Davis paid for what he did, that his actions didn't go unnoticed. With Isaiah by her side, Tasha stood up, feeling the strength of her son supporting her. They had already been through so much, but there was more to come. She couldn't let this go. The night had taken everything from them, but they were still standing. And that was what mattered. They were still fighting. Tiefel. You know, you were walking a bit too fast. Didn't stop for the crosswalk back there, Davis said, his voice dripping with judgment. Tasha blinked, trying to process what he was saying. She hadn't even noticed the crosswalk, and to be honest, it wasn't even that far away from where she had been walking. This was an odd complaint, but she didn't want to escalate things. I'm sorry, officer, Tasha replied, hoping he'd let her go without further question. Edish's mind was spinning. Her breath came in shallow gasps as the rope around her neck tightened. The world around her seemed to blur and fade. The cold ground beneath her felt hard, unforgiving. She tried to move, to fight back, but the weight of her own fear was paralyzing. Her heart raced as she struggled to break free, the ropes cutting into her wrists, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't loosen them. Officer Davis loomed over her, his face twisted with a cruel smirk, as if he enjoyed watching her struggle. He said nothing, his silence more terrifying than any words he could have spoken. Tasha felt the air grow thicker, her vision darkening as panic flooded her chest. She thought of her son, Isaiah. He had to be worried by now. What if he was looking for her? What if he was in danger, too? The thought made her heart ache, and it was the only thing that kept her from losing all hope. She couldn't give up. She couldn't let him think she was gone. Her hands, bound behind her back, were numb now. The tight rope cutting into her wrists made it impossible to feel anything, but she refused to let go of her thoughts of Isaiah. The memories of his bright smile and the way he used to hold her hand when he was younger flashed through her mind. He was strong, resourceful, just like his mother. If anyone could get them out of this situation, it was him. But just as Tasha felt herself losing the battle with consciousness, something shifted in the air around her. There was a sound: footsteps. Someone was coming. It wasn't just a distant noise, it was closer now. Tasha's ears strained, trying to catch every detail. Who was it? Was it a neighbor? A friend? Someone who could help? Her heart skipped a beat when she heard a voice, soft but steady. Mom. The voice was so familiar, so comforting. It was Isaiah. Her son had found her. Tasha tried to lift her head, to speak, but the effort was too much. The rope pulled tighter, making it even harder to breathe. Her vision was nearly gone now, a dark curtain falling over her eyes, but she heard Isaiah's voice again, closer this time. I'm here, Mom. Just hold on. The warmth in his voice gave her strength. Despite the tightness in her chest, the pain in her wrists, the fear in her heart, she found the energy to hold on just a little longer. She was going to be okay. Isaiah was here. Isaiah moved quickly, his steps loud and urgent. He didn't hesitate, didn't waste a second. The sight of his mother, bound and struggling for air, was enough to drive him into action. He had no time to think. There was no room for fear, no time for hesitation. He had to save her. With shaking hands, Isaiah looked around for something to help. His eyes scanned the alley, searching for anything that could free his mother from the ropes that held her prisoner. His gaze landed on a metal pipe lying nearby. Without a second thought, he grabbed it, gripping it tightly in his hands. The officer, still standing over Tasha, had not noticed Isaiah yet. He was too focused on the woman lying on the ground, too lost in his own arrogance and hatred to hear the approaching footsteps. Isaiah stepped forward, holding the pipe high, his body tense with a mix of fear and determination. In one swift motion, Isaiah swung the pipe at Officer Davis, hitting him in the back with a force that sent the officer stumbling forward. The surprise and shock were enough to knock Davis off balance, and he fell to the ground. For a split second, everything stopped. The air seemed to freeze. The officer was down, and Isaiah had his chance. "Mom, I'm getting you out of here," Isaiah shouted, his voice urgent but filled with strength. He rushed to Tasha's side, kneeling beside her, his hands trembling as he quickly tried to untie the ropes. His fingers worked frantically, undoing the knots that had bound her wrists and neck. As the ropes loosened, Tasha gasped, drawing in a deep breath of air. The pressure around her neck was finally lifted, and she could feel the life returning to her lungs. Isaiah's hands were steady now, as he worked faster, his mind focused only on one thing, getting his mother to safety. He finally freed her wrists and pulled her gently into his arms. Tasha's head lolled against his shoulder, weak but alive. She could barely keep her eyes open, but the moment she felt Isaiah's arms around her, she knew she was going to make it. "I'm here, Mom," Isaiah whispered, his voice soft but determined. "I'm not letting anything happen to you." But just as they began to move, Officer Davis, now on his feet, reached for his baton. He was seething, his eyes wide with fury, but his movements were slower now, unsteady from the shock of Isaiah's attack. "Get away from her!" Davis shouted, his voice a growl of anger. He raised the baton, swinging it toward Isaiah with a vicious strike. Isaiah reacted quickly, pushing Tasha out of the way and raising the metal pipe in his hand to block the officer's blow. The baton clashed against the pipe with a loud clang, and Davis stumbled backward, his face twisted in disbelief. "You think you can just get away with this?" Davis snarled, his breath heavy with rage. But Isaiah was unshaken. He stood his ground, the pipe still gripped tightly in his hands. He wasn't afraid of this officer. Not anymore. "I'm not afraid of you," Isaiah said, his voice calm but resolute. "You've hurt my mom, and I'm not letting you get away with it." The tension between them was palpable, but Isaiah's confidence was growing. He knew what he had to do. He wasn't going to let Officer Davis harm his mother any longer. Davis, clearly not used to being challenged, took another step forward, but this time, he hesitated. The power he had once held over the situation was slipping away. He was no longer the one in control. The young man standing in front of him had stripped him of that power, and it was becoming clear that he wasn't going to get it back. Isaiah took a deep breath, his eyes locked on the officers. He didn't need to fight this man. He just needed to make sure he couldn't hurt anyone else. "Leave now," Isaiah said, his voice firm. "This is over." The officer looked at him, eyes filled with a mixture of anger and shame. He had underestimated the strength of a young man who would do anything to protect his mother. Without another word, Davis turned and retreated, his head hung low, as if the fight had been taken out of him. Isaiah stood still, watching the officer leave, making sure he wouldn't turn back. Once Davis was gone, he rushed to Tasha's side, helping her to her feet. She leaned on him heavily, her body weak, but her heart filled with gratitude for her son. Isaiah helped her walk toward the street, where the sound of sirens could be heard in the distance. It wasn't over yet. But with her son by her side, Tasha knew they had already won. They had stood up to a man who thought he could break them, and they had shown him that no one, not even a badge, could take away their strength. For Isaiah and Tasha, this was just the beginning. But she could see in his eyes that he wasn't done. "You should be more careful," Officer Davis continued, his tone now sharp and accusing. "People like you don't pay attention. It's the little things, you know." Tasha felt her stomach tighten. There was something off about the way he was speaking to her. It wasn't just the tone, it was the way his words seemed to carry an edge, a subtle suggestion that she was somehow less than him. She had been on the receiving end of judgment before, but this felt different. Her instincts told her to stay calm and not let him provoke her. "I'll be more careful next time," she said, stepping toward her car. But Officer Davis wasn't ready to let her go. "Where do you think you're going?" he called out, his voice rising. Tasha froze, turning back to face him. "I'm just trying to get home, officer." "You think you're too good for the rules?" Davis sneered, stepping out of his car, his eyes narrowing. "You don't even respect the law." Tasha's heart began to race. She had no idea what he was getting at, but she knew the situation was escalating. She hadn't broken any laws, and yet here she was, being accused of something she hadn't done. Her mind raced, trying to figure out how to defuse the tension, but before she could respond, Davis took another step toward her, blocking her path. "Step away from the car," Davis ordered, his voice stern. Tasha stood still, unsure of what he was about to do. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said, trying to remain calm. But the officer's face grew darker, and his hand rested on the baton at his side. "Don't make me teach you a lesson, lady," Davis growled. "You people think you can get away with anything." Tasha's stomach churned as the words hit her. She had heard the rumors, the stories from people in the neighborhood about Davis' behavior, but she never thought it would happen to her. She wasn't going to let him get away with this. "I'm not going to fight you, officer. Just let me go," Tasha said, her voice trembling slightly. She reached for her phone in her purse, but Davis grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her back with surprising force. "You're not going anywhere," he snarled. His grip tightened, and Tasha winced in pain. She struggled to pull away, but his hand was like a vice around her wrist. Her heart raced as the fear began to seep in. This wasn't just an argument anymore. This was something much more dangerous. "I haven't done anything wrong," she shouted, trying to break free, but he shoved her to the ground. The shock of the impact knocked the breath out of her, and for a moment, she couldn't move. The world around her blurred, and her heart pounded in her ears. "You're going to learn some respect," Davis muttered, kneeling beside her. Before she could react, he pulled a thick rope from his belt, tying her hands tightly behind her back. His hands were rough and unrelenting as he bound her, the rope cutting into her skin. She could feel the panic rising inside her as she realized what was happening. "Let me go," Tasha shouted, but her voice barely carried through the evening air. The officer ignored her, his actions deliberate and cold. He tightened the knot around her wrists and then looped the rope around her neck, tightening it just enough to make it hard for her to breathe. Tasha gasped for air, her vision swimming. She felt herself slipping, her consciousness fading as the air grew thin. She tried to fight against the rope, but her hands were bound too tightly. Her legs kicked, but she couldn't free herself. The world was closing in on her, and all she could think about was her son, Isaiah. Isaiah had always been her strength. He was everything to her. But she couldn't protect him now. Not like this. Not when she was helpless, lying in the street, the air slipping away with every passing second. As the rope cut into her skin, and Officer Davis loomed over her with a sneer on his face, Tasha held onto one thought: she couldn't give up. For Isaiah. For herself. For the future. Just then, through the haze of fear and fading consciousness, she heard something: footsteps. Someone was coming. Was it a neighbor? A passerby? Or perhaps, the person who could finally stop this nightmare? Tasha clung to that hope, even as darkness began to take over her vision.